What is geological time? How did we come up with it? What kind of evidence do we use to work with it and build it up? And geological time is something that we had to build. It's not a naturally occurring thing out in the world. Geological time is a system made by people for our convenience in order to explain things that have happened in the past. This giant clock behind me is showing real time, right? Each second that passes by, it ticks away. And so like when physicists are talking about time, they talk about seconds and things like that, and divisions of seconds, and of course longer periods than that, right? But when geologists talk about time, we talk about something that we've invented. The geological time scale is an invented, created system that we use. And so how do we come up with some of the aspects of geological time? Well, so first off, here's a cartoon version of the geological time scale, and it shows all the time that we work with in geology. So we have the Archean, the Proterozoic. These are all maybe unusual names, but they kind of have some meaning to them. We have the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And so this is kind of shown as, you know, of import to geologists. We have the rock strata that correspond to those time periods. We have named time periods. We have absolute time here as ages with a numerical value. So we could have times that are 10,000 years ago, millions of years ago, even billions of years ago. And so geologists at first only had something called relative time. So we could see that there were rocks from one age that were above another. And so we knew that the ones that were closer to the surface were younger than the rocks that were below them. And so that was what geologists had to work with for a very long time, was this relative age system. But eventually we developed something called we developed radiometric dating in order to give us absolute time. And so you can kind of imagine here that we have the named system for relative time, and then we have these numerical values for absolute time determined through radiometric dating and some other things. But the important thing is that time for geologists correlates to rock strata and the things that are in those rocks, whether they're fossils of animals or plants, or if they're you know, isotopes of different radioactive elements. And so this is showing time from, you know, beginning to end as like a stack. Here we have time shown in a second way. This is almost like a clock face. So we have the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And so in this previous picture, we kind of had the same size slices for each period of time, more or less, right? But here we have the slices shown more relative to their duration. And so the Mesozoic is the time of the dinosaurs, right? Paleozoic is the time of amphibians and things like that. And the Cenozoic is the age of mammals, right? Or at least it used to be called age of mammals. And the time that we're familiar with is this small slice here. So for most of Earth's history, there was things were tremendously different than they are for anything that we're familiar with, right? I mean, we're familiar with you know, the modern world, and even with, you know, the world of the Mesozoic, we kind of can picture in our minds as a thing, right? But there was a tremendous amount of time before all that. You can kind of see here the Paleozoic is larger than the Mesozoic even, and then before that is just a tremendous amount of deep time. So this is huge spans of time that are even hard for people to understand. Or relate to, and that's kind of nicely shown in this picture. All right, so now where did we even start off with this idea of dividing time like that? Well, so in the 1759, an Italian named Giovanni Arduino proposed something like the system that we have today. And so he came up with this idea of having primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary orders of time. Called them orders. Instead of eras or epochs or something like that. And this really just means first, second, third, and fourth. And so he was working in the Swiss Alps, and he was talking about rocks. The primary rocks were closer, more central in the mountain belt. The secondary rocks were further out, and so forth. And when you get to the foothills of the Alps, you had the quaternary order of rocks. And he also noticed that there was, so there's a geographical correlation here, right? There's a correlation in space for these rocks, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. But there was also a different types of rock for each of these ages. So he found that in the primary age, there were mostly schists, which are metamorphic rocks. And then in other, you know, the secondary and tertiary periods, he found harder sedimentary rocks. And then at those foothills for the quaternary, he found soft, not as strongly lithified sedimentary rocks. So even the rock type and the space was important for this system. So this started out as a way to formally name geological periods, geological time. The system he came up with, it kind of gave way to terms like the Paleozoic, which I just mentioned, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. So this person, he didn't actually publish his ideas. He shared his ideas with other people, and we kind of find letters written by him and other people attesting to this. But he didn't publish it in the way that scientists normally publish things today. But they ended up being widely used by other geologists. So these terms kind of pop up being used by other geologists as if the term was known, right? And it was only in that context of, oh, you know these other workers, and you've maybe talked to Arduino or read his letters, that you can even make sense of this. So the first person to mention it wasn't necessarily the first person to come up with it. So Arduino used this term orders for his ages. We eventually settle on these ideas or a scheme using eras, periods, epochs, and then ages and stages and other subdivisions. And it's all just made up. We could have still called them orders. They don't have any important meaning to them where we should have to use those words for them, right? But geologists have liked to divide time up into nested, increasingly shorter periods of time by using these terms. So his primary and secondary were dropped almost immediately. They were useful for places like the Alps, but obviously not everywhere is the Alps. There are places where you don't have all of these other rocks. So it was used in the Alps, but then the further away you got from there, the less useful it became. But there was something ultimately useful to this, and geologists all across the world ended up adapting this scheme with some alterations. So like I said, primary and secondary get dropped. Tertiary was used up until this last decade. So up until relatively recently, we still had a tertiary period. And that was, if you talked about the extinction of the dinosaurs, they talk about the KT boundary, the tertiary, Cretaceous tertiary boundary. But tertiary has now fallen out of favor. We don't even use that anymore. Instead, we use things like Paleogene for that dinosaur extinction event, the KPG boundary. And so now, but even today, still, we do use his quaternary, his fourth order of time. And so some of these different workers would look at different rocks and come up with different names for different epochs of time. And so Agassiz, who I've talked about before, he came up with this term Pleistocene for his ice ages. And other workers came up with other ones. And it was really important. If the term was used widely, it was only used widely if it was useful. So it was just a matter of convenience, and if the terminology could be applied to the rocks that someone was working on. And eventually we come up with this kind of, globally used time scale. So now, if you think about it, to even get at this point, at Arduino's point, right, you need to have a lot of things down pat, right? You need to understand what fossils are in order to look at the fossils that are present and say if I'm in the primary or secondary order of time, right? You need to know what strata are. They're very clearly shown here. So Arduino was not an academic geologist. He was a mining specialist and a surveyor. And so this is a lot of science has gone on to get to the point where someone can even make these kinds of figures and then start talking about time on top of that. And then he had to be able to identify the minerals that were present in this in order to talk about rocks that had been metamorphosed or rocks that were sedimentary. So a lot of geology has to happen before you can even get to the point of being able to come up with this scheme of time. So today we very often use something called radiometric dating. So in radiometric dating, we have radioactive parent isotopes that decay over time into daughter isotopes or daughter products. So we have an element changing into another element. That's a nuclear reaction. And so if we know how much there is of the parent and daughter products, we can work out how old that sample is, because the parent decays into the daughter over a controlled and relatively an invariant period of time called the half-life, right? So over a half-life, half of the material has been changed from parent to daughter product. And whatever parent remains over another half-life, half of that will be changed also, and half and half and half, so on. So this doesn't get changed by temperature. It doesn't get changed by altitude. It doesn't change when rocks are buried deep under the earth or exposed at the surface. This rate of decay is constant. And if you have any rate like a speed or anything like that, you can work out time. right? So we're able to work backwards by looking at the relative proportion of parent and daughter product to figure out how old the rock is, to figure out how long that daughter product has been accumulating. So when rock is molten, it's, or at least very hot but not totally molten like it might be when it's buried, things like these isotopes, these elements, can flow in and out of the rock. And so daughter elements that are produced in like a sample of molten magma, they could flow away and leave the magma and go somewhere else. So when we're dating rock, when we're doing radiometric dating, we're looking at the age at which the rock cooled into a solid, right? And at the age at which the magma cooled into a solid rock. And so here you have this picture showing you can imagine a sample of rock, and over time more and more of that daughter product accumulates. This could be a sample of magma, and material could flow out of it. It could be a mineral. Each one of these boxes could be a mineral over its life, and so you have the mineral forming at the point at which it cools, and then over time, while it's sitting in a rock, the daughter product starts accumulating. These individual atoms are being changed into the daughter products, and we can count them up. So the age that we get for a rock in radiometric dating is the age at which the rock cooled. So for igneous rocks, the age at which the rock cooled is the age at which the rock formed in the first place. Now, alternatively, for metamorphic rocks, you might get an age that is the age at which maybe mountain building occurred to metamorphose that rock, right? So with a metamorphic rock, you take an igneous rock or a sedimentary rock, and you put it under a lot of pressure and high temperature, and you can kind of maybe not melt the minerals entirely, right? Some of them can melt away. Other ones might just become partially molten, and they can kind of outgas and lose some of their elements, so that some of these daughter products that have been built up can be lost. And you're kind of then resetting their radiometric age. And now when the metamorphism slows down or stops, or the rock gets exposed to the surface, they cool, and now the clock has been reset. So for metamorphic rocks, the radiometric age or the radiometric dating tells us about things like mountain building and when the mountains formed, right? So it depends on, you have to know your mineralogy and the context of your sample in order to know what that age is even telling you, right? So radiometric dating is something that gets us an absolute age for material in a number of years, right? It reports a numerical value for us. Now, so this is kind of a crazy graphic, but so it's kind of interesting. When humans first developed nuclear weapons, they were performing lots of tests on those weapons. And by testing a nuclear weapon, what I mean is you blow them up, you set them off. And this results in a lot of fallout and a release of radioactive isotopes in a large enough amount that it actually affects radiometric dating. And so scientists have been able to take advantage of this. They can look at, they could study how quickly radioisotopes from fallout would get picked up, say, at the surface of the ocean as the dust settles on the ocean. So you can look at radioactive carbon being carried through the ocean. You can take a sample of water from different depths in the ocean, and then you can use carbon dating in particular to determine the age, not of the water, right? The water may be formed at the start of the Earth, but the age at which since that water sample was at the surface, and when it picked up this radioactive carbon, and then as it sank and was transported through the ocean system, over time it accumulated more and more of the daughter product. That fallout spike also turns up in tree ring records, and so it allows us to correlate different tree rings. And things like, so there's actually a lot of other products of human activity that are important for different types of geological dating or geological time. So like some factories produce lead as a waste product, and they might dump their waste product into a river, which they very often did, not so many decades ago, and still do today in some places. And so you can see in the sediments from a river, you might see a spike in the amount of lead or a spike in the amount of chromium. And we can actually usually often tie that to the date at which a particular factory was active, because they're not necessarily active forever and just ongoing. So we can get some pretty fine scale information about the age of river and ocean sediments because of these pollutants that we put into it, basically. And so this is kind of an interesting article here. This graphic is taken from this article about how nuclear testing has changed a lot of things for us. Right. Okay, so now here is another way that we can get at geological time. So this is the oxygen isotope record. So now isotopes are elements, atoms of elements, right? And so you can have an atom of an element that has the normal amount of neutrons in it, or you can have an atom that has an excess amount of neutrons in it, or you can have an atom of an element that has not enough or not the normal amount of neutrons in it, right? So they can all have different number of neutrons and still be the same element. And so we call those elements with different numbers, those atoms of an element with different numbers of neutrons, isotopes, right? So oxygen has a lot of different isotopes. The ones that are of interest here are oxygen 18 and oxygen 16. And they're used in a lot of different ways. So what you have here is a figure that shows the variation in the ratio of oxygen 18 and oxygen 16, right? So sometimes you have more of one and sometimes you have less of the other. So this oxygen 18 and 16 ratio, right, it varies not just through time, but according to a lot of different processes in the ocean and the atmosphere and even the ice sheets. So scientists can reconstruct and correlate long charts showing this variation in oxygen 18 and 16 over time. So now during an ice age, during an ice age, there's a huge amount of ice on the Earth, right? And so a lot of the water on the Earth has been trapped in ice sheets and glaciers. The fact that the water has been trapped in those glaciers and trapped on land and is not available in the ocean skews this 18 and 16 ratio. So the record gets really distorted, and people can read out ice volumes from charts like this. It's the amount of ice is a major driver for the difference in the 18 and 16 ratio. Things like salinity and even temperature can affect it. So researchers can look at different samples of rock or water or ice from ice cores, and they can measure the amount of oxygen 18, the amount of oxygen 16, and they can produce charts like this over long periods of time. And they can look at samples that are from different ages and correlate one to another. And they can really stretch out these records for a long period of time. So now once you have an established record like this, that everyone kind of agrees is a good and global record and representative of the world for these different times, you can do some radiometric dating on your samples and then tie this variation in this pattern that you have to time. So you might be able to date a few of these samples. Maybe some of them are the shells of a mollusk or something, and we can look at the oxygen isotopes that are present and look at the carbon isotopes that are present. So we can get age from the carbon, perhaps, or some other systems, right? So we can tie in age to our oxygen isotope pattern. Now, when we get a new sample, so oxygen isotope measurements are relatively easy. And if we get a new sample of unknown age, we might be able to easily identify its oxygen isotope ratios and the pattern of those ratios within it, and then match it to a portion of this larger, kind of reference pattern. And then through that, we can tell how old a sample was, or at least get a wide estimate of how old a sample was. So this record actually also shows changes in these oxygen isotope values over time. It's showing changes in ice volumes, ice ages, and it's also showing something else. You can see the pattern here is very narrow and it doesn't vary over a large scale, but here it varies over a really big scale. The low and the high are very wide, and here the low and the high are not as wide as here, but are much wider than over here. So this kind of this amplitude variation is driven by something called a Milankovitch cycle, and there's different aspects of the Milankovitch cycle. So we can actually read these Milankovitch cycles through these records, and the Milankovitch cycle is one of the things that drives global climate, and it's what pushes us into and takes us out of an ice age. And so all that kind of matches up very nicely here, so that we can see all of that. Now, okay, so the oxygen isotope record is sometimes included along with our understanding of geological time, right? And it kind of informs that. So we also have something else, another technique called paleomagnetism or magnetostratigraphy. So the Earth has a normal magnetic field, right? The Earth has a magnetic field all the time, and that field can be picked up by rocks as they cool. They get kind of magnetized a little bit. So as long, it's kind of like with radioactive dating. Once the rocks cool, they get set or frozen, and their radioactive age starts from that point. And when they cool, they also no longer can take on any changes in the magnetic field. Their magnetic field is now set. So sometimes now also the magnetic field of the Earth changes, and we might have a magnetic polar reversal. So right now we have we have the Arctic, and that's where the geographic North Pole is. It is also the place where the magnetic North Pole is. If you think of just any magnet, it has a north and a south pole to it, right? The Earth itself has a north and south pole. And so for a lot of the times, the magnetic North Pole and the geographic North Pole are pretty close to each other. They're at least in the same hemisphere. But sometimes they are not. Sometimes the Arctic has the magnetic South Pole, and the Antarctic has the magnetic North Pole. So that's called a reversed magnetic field for the Earth. So now any rocks that are formed during a magnetic reversal are going to, as they are erupted from, say, a rift or a volcano, they will record that reversed magnetic field, and as they cool, and so this can go on for a very long time, and then people can eventually come by and they can measure the strength of the magnetic field on different rocks. And when we started doing that, what we realized was that some rocks had anomalous magnetic fields. And it turns out that anomaly is because you now have this normal north-south field, but the rock was formed when that was reversed. So when you kind of pass over that rock, you get a weakened magnetic field. When you pass over rocks that line up with today's normal magnetic field, you get kind of like an amplified magnetic field. So we can get a pattern of normal and reversed polarity from our rock samples. And so that pattern is one of those patterns is shown here. And so in black we have normal polar magnetic field, in white we have reversals, and you can see, so this chart here has a number of magnetic reversals. It extends over 5 million years. We can name the magnetic reversals, and we can also date them. So maybe the rock can be radiometrically dated to give us an absolute age. And so we know when these things have occurred. So notice now, hominins, which are humans and our close extinct relatives, we evolved around 7 million years ago. So a little bit before this chart starts. So we've been through many magnetic reversals over the course of our evolution, and it seems to have no effect on us. No one really looks at. There have been no changes in human anatomy or even human culture as you get to more modern times. Or even just the population of humans over time that's correlated with these magnetic reversals. And we don't see it in the animal world either. So it doesn't seem like magnetic reversals are destructive events. The only evidence we really have for them are the magnetic record in the rocks. Right? There's no other set of things that seem to be occurring because of them. So kind of interestingly, we might be living through a polar reversal right now. We don't know for certain, but some odd things are going on with our magnetic field. So the poles, like they can reverse, but they're also slowly drifting over time. And so as long as we've been looking at the magnetic poles, they've actually been moving. And they could drift around without it being part of a reversal. But on the other hand, a reversal probably looks like a strongly drifting magnetic pole, right? So we don't know what's going on right now, but in terms of reversals. But we do know that the magnetic North Pole has been drifting for a long time, and so you can see here it's been drifting since, well, for about 200 years, as long as we've been measuring it, really. And recently there's been a big increase in the rate of drift. So it's drifting towards Russia, and recently it started accelerating towards Russia, to Siberia in Russia. And so now it's at a rate of around 34 miles per year that the magnetic North Pole is moving towards this part of Siberia. And so I'm saying now this started around 2018. It's a very recent thing. And so maybe a polar reversal is starting. We don't know. Maybe it's going to accelerate really fast and just flip over and switch. So now if you've ever used a compass for things like navigating or orienteering, you have to adjust your compass to the local declination. So there's this offset between magnetic north and geographical north. And our maps are kind of set to geographical north, right? But our compasses point to magnetic north. And so there's an offset between those. And so if you get a map for a place, it'll tell you what the declination is. You can adjust your compass so that you can account for that difference in the two norths, right? And so scientists update maps over time. But this recent, fast movement, it wasn't insignificant, right? It wasn't just fast, but meaningless. It was fast enough that it actually changed the way in which we have to now update all of our maps and update our compasses. So it was kind of a big event and concerned a lot of people, and it seems to still be going on. So was it big enough to change our maps and maybe even, the start of a reversal for all we know? Kind of interesting. Now, none of this has anything to do with something called crustal displacement or crustal displacement theory. So this is an idea that kind of refuses to die and has been around for a long time, and it pops up every time people talk about magnetic fields and magnetic reversals, certainly. So people use it to explain a lot of data associated with plate tectonics, like the existence of glaciation in places that are now tropical, or magnetic anomalies and things like that. So what is it? Crustal displacement is the idea that the crust of the Earth detaches from the mantle and kind of rolls over the mantle like a loose skin. And that's how you get these polar reversals, and you get a lot of this other things, evidence like having glaciers and ice sheets where they shouldn't be. And so that's kind of what's shown in this picture. This is from a movie called 2012, and the plot of 2012 was that there was a crustal displacement and people had to survive through it. But so nothing like this happens. It would be completely catastrophic if the North Pole physically slid down around the Earth to the South Pole, right? It'd be catastrophic. You wouldn't be able to survive it. And we've seen if you look back at that other magnetic reversal chart, we've gone through 26 events or more like that, 26 or more polar reversals. So forget about surviving one. You'd have to, as a human species, survive 26 of these events. Not very likely, right? That's not going to happen. Going through all of that, but so it's kind of something that always pops up. I feel like people should be a little bit aware of this. I'm not, when I'm talking about polar reversals, talking about this, talking about crustal displacement. So from that controversy to another one, we're going to look at in a little bit more detail the geological ages, the terms we have for some of them. But recently, not just recently, but for a few years now, scientists have said that we've entered a new geological era, right? So we're not, of course, we're not in the Mesozoic, we're in the Cenozoic, and these eras can change over time. So people have been talking for a long time, at least informally, about there being something called the Anthropocene, right? The age of man, right? Anthro being man or human, and scene being the time, recent times. So for a while, people have talked about the Anthropocene as a geological age associated with humans and our effect on the world. So you can kind of imagine like the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic is set by this tremendous impact that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, caused a huge extinction of all kinds of other animals. It left a layer of space material, the metals like iridium that are more common in space, all around the Earth. So it's something that can be detected. That boundary can be detected through fossils and through geology. And what a lot of people have said are saying now with this term Anthropocene is that you can look at the rock record and you can see that humans are around, right? It's not just that you can find people on Earth, but if you only had a sample of just recently formed rock, you'd be able to say there's something like humans on this planet, right? You can see an increase in carbon dioxide in the rocks. You can see changes in the ratios of carbon dioxide, or rather of the carbon isotopes in it. So there's some signal in the rock that indicates people are active and industrial civilization is here. So now this group of researchers called the Anthropocene Working Group, they're part of the organization that is responsible for geological time. So when we first started this, I was talking about Arduino, and he would just talk to his friends basically, and they would more or less agree to use certain terms when they're talking to each other. And if everyone did that forever, we'd have a very confusing set of terms for geological time. So geologists have kind of agreed that there's one group called the ICS, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, to take charge of the terms and dates used for geological time. So within that group, within that organization, there is this Anthropocene Working Group, and it's a small group of about 30 or something scientists who work on these kind of issues. And so they, in 2019, after there had been so much informal talk about the Anthropocene, came up with this kind of survey of their members. You know, should the Anthropocene be treated as a real chronostratigraphic unit, a real time period for geology? And so they voted on that, and they decided, yes, it should. Should the primary guide for the base of the Anthropocene, the start of the Anthropocene, be one of the stratigraphic signals around the mid-20th century of the Common Era? And around 29 of them voted that they should. So both of these things passed. They used that kind of specific terminology because they wanted it to be starting. They wanted the Anthropocene to start with the spike in nuclear test fallout in the radionuclides that come out of these nuclear tests, because that's a very strong signal. They're kind of unnatural, abnormal isotopes, and so if you see them, you can be sure that there have been nuclear tests. So they kind of backloaded it. They didn't want to specify what signal they should be using, but they should at least be a signal around this time. So this is kind of a big deal. It was in a lot of papers and a lot of scientific publications that we finally decided not to define the Anthropocene, but to at least start the process of defining it. That's what they've agreed to do, right? That there is something like it, and we should start trying to define it. But they were actually beaten to the punch by a different group within the same ICS. And so it's probable, you know, some critics have said that the Anthropocene group took way too long to do all of their work, and still has not come up with all the definitions for it. So in the meantime, or as this was going on, another group came up with a definition for a few different new ages. So according to this new group, and it's been approved by the ICS, so this is the, you know, official terminology that we can and should use, we are now in the Megalion epoch. It started 4,700 years ago, and it goes right to today. It could end today if we decide to end it, right? And if there's some, you know, other signal in the rock record to start a new age off of. And so the Megalion starts with not 4,000 years ago with nuclear testing, but with a set of massive droughts that disrupted human civilizations at the time. And it's mostly recorded in oxygen isotopes in rock records from that time. It's called the Megalion because the rocks that were particularly looked at by this group are in a part of India called Meghalaya, and they looked at some caves, stalactites, in order they drilled these cave stalactites and measured the oxygen isotopes there, and were able to find evidence of these droughts that then tie into these problems that a lot of ancient civilizations of humans went through. So they got it out there first, and they went through the normal way of doing this. So we don't actually use the term Anthropocene, which is what you'll see in a lot of the papers and a lot of the, in like the newspaper or public media. Instead, what geologists are working with is something called the Megalion. So we are in the Megalion age. So that's since 2018. So to recap, geologists have developed the idea of dividing the Earth into ages. They use radiometric dating, magnetic polarity information, isotopic ages in order to do this. And today we're in an age called the Megalion, which is part of the Holocene. And so we're going to look at a chart showing some of these different ages, but that's kind of a recap of what I've been talking about. So let's take a look at this chart here. So it's a poster, it's folded in half. It's the geological timescale as of 2012. It gets updated relatively frequently as the evidence requires. So let me just go into this mode here, and you can see, so here's a close-up of the chart. And so first, let's look at this. We have all of geological time from the Hadean, right, the age of Hades, a time when the Earth was still being bombarded by gigantic meteorites, and the surface of the Earth would have been molten. So a hellish landscape, the Hadean, right? And so that starts around 4.56 billion years ago. It's the formation of the Earth. Right up here, the formation of the Earth, right? And there's about 500 million years before we get into a time period called the Archean. And so Arche means ancient. So this is an ancient time. And then if we move through the Archean, we go into something called the Proterozoic, which is this red period here, or it's called an eon. And then we get into the Phanerozoic, which is this light blue. And the Phanerozoic is Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic up till today. So this is the time of dinosaurs. This is the time of the ice ages and the Cenozoic. And the Paleozoic is the pre-dinosaur time when things like amphibians were the only thing on land, amphibians and insects. So a tremendous amount of time was like nothing we're familiar with. From the molten surface of the Earth to just a planet that's only made up of bacteria and single-celled organisms. We'll look a little closer at this. Focus in. So this Proterozoic. So zoic means is the same word that zoo is based off of. So zoic means life. Proterozoic means the first life. So this is a time when there was life on Earth, but it was just bacteria, single-celled organisms, and eventually you get things like with more organized cells that have things like a nucleus and organelles that make them up, instead of just algae and bacteria, right? More complicated cells. But for the Proterozoic, life was microscopic during the entire time, right? And it's divided up into its own little ages. So we have the Paleoproterozoic, the Mesoproterozoic, right? The Paleo meaning ancient, Meso meaning middle, Neo meaning new, part of the Proterozoic, and then that's divided into those are different eras. Now we can look at different periods. There was the Ediacaran and Cryogenian periods of the Neoproterozoic. Here is a map of the Earth during this Cryogenian. And so this is a time when there was a lot of land at the South Pole, and it had a large ice sheet built up on it, and there might have been glaciers even further on land at that time. This is 650 million years ago, and the world looked very different than today. We had kind of one single continent. We had an ocean that we call the Pan-Thalassic Ocean, and we also had a Pan-African Ocean over here. And now, so you can kind of see, I think it's a little bit hard to see perhaps, but we have the Antarctic continent, we have West Africa. Here's where the Congo is. So what today is called the Congo was once here, far below the equator. This is Amazonia, not Antarctica. Here is Antarctica, right on the equator. So during this time, if any place was ice-free, it was in Antarctica. And you can see India over here. Here is Australia, and different parts of land. So they don't look like they do today. This is just the land that would eventually become these continents that we're familiar with, right? Okay, so that's the Proterozoic. All right. Now, as we move into a more familiar world, we go from the Ediacaran into the Cambrian. And it's during the Cambrian that you might have heard of something called the Cambrian explosion, when there was just a huge number of different body forms developed by animals. You had multicellular animals with all kinds of strange body types. So we're used to a very straightforward kind of world where animals have a head and there's a body and there's maybe many limbs or just a few limbs coming off that body. The weirdest things get to us, I think, is maybe things like starfish, which instead of having this bilateral symmetry that we have where one half of our face looks like the other half, and one half of our body looks like the other half, they have a radial kind of symmetry. That's why they have six arms, starfish and other weird animals like that. So anyway, so there's not too much variety in terms of body forms today, but during the Cambrian, there were things that you could never imagine, like things that have arms with heads at the end of them and things like that, right? Or mouths coming out of their stomachs. Very weird time. So, but the Cambrian, with all of its weirdness, eventually moves into some other periods of time, like the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. The periods of the Paleozoic are the Cambrian, the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian. At the end of the Permian, there's a tremendous extinction event. It's the biggest extinction event that we know of. Almost everything, almost all life gets wiped out, at least all large multicellular life. It's called the end Permian event. And so when there are these large catastrophes, that's how we usually actually decide to draw a line for new geological times. So there's nothing real about this division. It's just a division that we like. That makes sense. So now after the Permian, we go into now not just another period, but a new era, the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And we get into when the Cretaceous ends with the impact at Chicxulub in the Yucatan. We have an extinction event that brings us into the Paleogene and brings us into the Cenozoic era. And we don't even see the many divisions of the Cenozoic here because the space is just too small. So this chart has a few different parts to it. So now here I have a part. I guess I should zoom out a little. So here we have time scale that looks only at the Proterozoic era. And so the Proterozoic was a long period of time. Sorry, the Paleozoic. And it's divided up into these different times that we talked about before. And so here, for example, is the Paleozoic that I mentioned. And then we have our Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian. In the United States, we do something different. So here we have, I'll zoom in a little so people see it. So this is the Carboniferous, but in the US, we've decided not to call it the Carboniferous. We call it the Mississippian for one part and the Pennsylvanian for another part. And so carbon means coal. And this is an age where where a lot of the coal beds that we mine today were put down. So that's true for the U.S. and it's true for the world. So when like the British and French geologists were coming up with these terms, they called it the Carboniferous age, the carbon or coal bearing, ferrous means carrying or bearing age. And when we did it, we said, well, these rocks we're looking in rocks in Mississippi where we have lots of coal, or we're looking in rocks in Pennsylvania that have lots of coal. So we'll call it after these times, after these places. That's one place where there's some small disagreements. The ICS, the people that produced this map, have kind of allowed for that disagreement. And so, alternatives are divided up to the early, middle, and late, and then there are different stages within that. Okay, so that's the Paleozoic, right? Now, on the other chart, we can look at just the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, right? So here we have, I'm holding up this thing in two ways, but we have the Phanerozoic. We looked at the Paleozoic. Now we look at another scale showing the Meso and Cenozoic. That's this one. So we'll start with the older rocks. Hopefully I can work that out. Okay, so here's the start of the Mesozoic with the Triassic rather. So that Triassic period age can be divided into the early, middle, and late. Sometimes we don't have fancy names for these things. And then there are even smaller and smaller stages. And now here we have our magnetostratigraphy. We have our times of reversed and normal polarity. So we're able to track these changes in rocks of this age also. And the Triassic is 250, starts just over 250 million years ago. So we're still able to find these paleomagnetic data going back then. And we move through the Triassic into the Jurassic. So dinosaurs and things like that evolved in the Triassic. And they came to dominance in the Jurassic, right? For people that know a little bit about paleontology or are interested in that, right? So that's why so many dinosaur fossils are associated with the Jurassic. Now I'm just trying to straighten this map out a little. Okay, so so we had the Jurassic, which is actually named after the Jurus Mountains in I think they're part of the Swiss Alps. Swiss Alps keeps coming up, and there's an early, middle, and late part of the Jurassic. It has different ages or stages, like the Kimmeridgian, the Oxfordian, and all kinds of ages. And they again have this magnetic age to them. Then we move into at around 145 million years from the Jurassic into the Cretaceous. And so this is when dinosaurs like T-Rex were around. So the age of dinosaurs lasted for a very long time, and the stages or ages here are things like the Berriasian, the Aptian, the Albian, the Cenomanian, the Turonian, and the end of the Cretaceous is the Maastrichtian. That's the last age of the dinosaurs. And if you look here now, we also have not just the magnetic ages, but we have, this is a track of sea level, primarily based off of well, largely based off of oxygen isotope ratios and some other types of data. And at the end of the Cretaceous, right, we have the transition to the Cenozoic. So that's the end of the Mesozoic, the end of the Cretaceous, start of the Cenozoic, where we have the Paleocene epoch. Or actually, I should say it like this. We have the Cenozoic, and then it's divided into two major parts. We have the Paleogene and the Neogene. Okay, and those times themselves are divided up into some smaller pieces. So within the Paleogene, we have the Paleocene, just to make things a little confusing. And then we have the Eocene and the Oligocene. Oligo means something like short, right? So we have ancient, Eo means dawn, so very old time, the dawn time, the shortest, longest time ago, and the Miocene, the middle time, and the Pliocene and the Pleistocene, right? So now we'll again move over to another chart that shows just the Cenozoic. So I'm going to fold this map up. See it. Okay, so now this is all of the Cenozoic, and we'll look at the map, at the chart. And now we have some more information, some more stuff that's going on. So first we have the Cenozoic and its Neogene. The Neogene can be divided up into the Pliocene. And then when we move out of the Neogene, sorry, that's not showing. As we move out of this Neogene era, or period rather, Neogene. So the Cenozoic starts around, oh no, sorry, this is not only the Cenozoic, this is really just the Neogene, right? So the Neogene started around 5.5, almost 5.3 million years ago. So again, we're looking at just this Neogene quaternary, right? The much more recent time. So not the Paleogene, just the Neogene. That Neogene is divided up. Let me turn it like this for a second. It's part of the Cenozoic era. The Neogene is a period within the Cenozoic. And then after the Neogene comes the Quaternary, that fourth order that Arduino have been talking about. It's the last surviving piece of his system. And it's divided up, they're each divided up on their own. So the Neogene has the Pliocene within it. The Quaternary has the Pleistocene, have the Holocene. And the Holocene is a small slice of time. It's shown to scale here, but only on this part of it. It's actually so small of a period of time that we can't even write it in the font would be too small to even read, right, if we had written it. So the Holocene is kind of when we transition from the period of the ice ages. So there was not one ice age, there were many ice ages, but it's when we come out of the ice ages and come into the modern era of geological time. And so now it's on top of this that you can then stick things like the Anthropocene or the Megalion. Now, in addition to those divisions, so we have, so again, these are the ages, right? And I'm going to zoom in a little on this. So we have our magnetically derived, or our magnetostratigraphy, and sometimes we can name these times. So we have the Jaramillo, we have the Olduvai, normal, and there's a whole convention for naming these things with crons and polarity. And so we have lots of different ways to talk about them, but we have that pattern that we talked about earlier. And so this is the Brunhes normal that we are still in. It's a very long last. This is the Brunhes, which is the normal that we're in now, and it's been going on for the entirety of this Ionian, stage, and the Tarantian, and then our modern Holocene on top of that. This is the Brunhes normal. It's normal because it's written in black, and it's a very long time. You can compare that to the Jaramillo, right, which is another normal, but it was only a small period of time, or even this much smaller one. Now over here, we have not sea level, but the oxygen, this is called Del 18O. So this is the oxygen 18, oxygen 16 ratio. It's not just the ratio, it's the ratio in a certain standardized form. This was worked out, this record is worked out by workers named Lysecki and Ramo. They did this in 2005. And so this happens a lot in science where, you know, when people come up with a record that is very good, it becomes kind of the standard. And so this paper of theirs has been like cited in like more than 2,000 other scientific papers, right? Because it's such they did such great work on this, establishing this record. And so this record for Del 18O, it goes from today through time all the way through this entire slice of the time, geological time, up to the start of the Neogene. And so on this side, you have a Del 18O value that indicates the temperature is warmer than today. And on this side, you have a Del 18O value that is cooler than today. Coming off the screen. So just looking at this, so in the Zanclean or the Pliocene, it was warm, right? So this is the Del 18, the oxygen 18 and oxygen 16 ratio. It's controlled by a lot of things. And it's in part controlled by temperature. So it gets put into things like seashells and rocks, and those two elements get put in at different rates based on the temperature. So that's why we're able to work out temperature for it. So we can do lab studies and experiments to work out in detail, you know, what the exact ratio is and the exact temperature under which it should form, right? And also things like salinity and other properties of the water. So most of the Pliocene was very warm, according to the Del 18O. And you can kind of see that it had these this kind of fast pacing to it, with many of these squiggles changing quickly over time. And then as we move along, we start getting to a different type of pattern overall. And now we have this pattern where instead of these small, this is kind of where the transition occurs, right? We had lots of different squiggles and wiggles in these lines, right? And but then eventually they take on this kind of pattern where there's a peak and then a drop, and it stays dropped for a while, and then a peak, and then it kind of in stages drops, and then it's not always exactly the same, but you get this kind of pattern. And so now this line here is the boundary between the Pliocene and the Pleistocene. So we've entered the era of ice ages. And so this Del 18O record catches not just temperature, but it also is strongly affected by ice volume. And so each one of these things that you have here is a little ice age, where things get very cold, ice sheets start forming. It starts off as, you know, there's one summer where it's very cold and the snow from last year or the last winter doesn't melt before the New Year's snow falls on it, right? And so you build up snow over time. And then that snow builds up into ice ages and ice sheets. And then it melts and it goes through its pattern. And this pattern is driven by a lot of things, but primarily something called astronomical forcing through the Milankovitch cycle. There is also, so now this pattern is so well known that we've actually divided these stages, these squiggles, into numbered stages. So that people can reference them. So sometimes people specialize or are only talking about, you know, marine isotope stage 22. We call them marine isotope stages because they're based off these oxygen isotopes. And stage 18 and 12. And if you notice, the even numbered ones are cold. So the generally. So the even numbered marine isotope stages are ice ages. The odd numbered ones are what are called interglacials or interstadials, where it's not an ice age. And so now we have here, if I said before that we went from small squiggles to this pattern, that pattern becomes more and more dominant over time in this Del 18O record, right? And now by here, it's very strong, right? We build up and then we drop. And then we have what's sometimes called a sawtooth pattern. It looks like the edge of a saw. where there's these many small wiggles, but they're building up and up and up to an ice age, and then the ice age ends very rapidly. It doesn't end it doesn't end a little bit or start warming and cool again and warming and cool again like it does when it builds up. So these are not symmetrical. There's a difference between going into an ice age and coming out of an ice age. Here is 12,000 years ago. This is the time of the Younger Dryas, which was a period of rapid cooling that happened after an ice age. It's not really caught in this record. The Younger Dryas might only be a northern hemisphere, or sometimes, at first it was thought to only be a European event. It's probably global. It might not be. It's not really caught well in this record. It's a very brief event. But so moving on. So we can see this changing pattern of ice ages as shown by this Del 18O pattern. And then, totally off there. We get to this ice age, and we start building up into the modern, and the modern looks just like every other ice age that ended, right? It built up to the ice, building up those ice sheets and glaciers, and then it warms up rapidly. And now that's where we are today in this record. So we're in probably one of these interglacial periods, and they end over time and they end relatively rapidly. So how long are we talking about here? Well, each one of those, I think it's maybe a little hard to see this. So here's today at 0. Here's 500,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. And each one of these larger segments is 100 million years. Sorry, 100,000 years, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500,000 years. So, and these ice ages kind of correspond to something like that. Right? There's about 100,000 years going into it and coming out of it. So these are long-term events. Even though it's the end of this chart, even these individual ice ages are tremendously long from our perspective. So 100,000 years, I mean, our civilization has been around for since maybe 4,700, 5,000 BC. So we've been around for 6,000 or 7,000 years that we've been writing things down, or at least have been producing artifacts. We can't deal with 10 times, 20 times that long, let alone the entire time scale, right? So again, just looking back at the whole time scale now. So we don't have this 18O record going back to the start. But so all that stuff we were just talking about with all the ice ages and everything else was in here, right? So this is the Paleogene, and then that entire chart that we looked at, which filled this entire page, was the Neogene. And everything, all of our history and all the ice ages and everything is in here. And this chart just goes on and on, all through these different ages down to, again, the Hadean at 4.5 billion years ago. So now actually I want to quickly, we looked at Earth during the Cryogenian. Let's look at Earth at some other periods. This is Earth during the Silurian, right? So 425 million years ago. And we have not a Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean. We still have our Panthalassic Ocean. And we have something called the Paleotethys Ocean. And this is, we had many small islands and just a few supercontinents. If we go up into the Carboniferous, this is a time when things are relatively warm. And we had a large amount of land exposed and a lot of land in equatorial regions. So it produced a lot of, there was a lot of rainforests, a lot of swamps, and a lot of plant matter being produced. That plant matter then gets buried, preserved, and turns into coal. So that's why this time is called the Carboniferous. A lot of the coal that is being used all around the world came from this time. It's not continuously and always being produced everywhere, necessarily. And now if we come here, this is the Permian. Okay, so 255 million years ago, about 250 million years ago. The Permian is a time where the temperatures are very warm. There are swamps all over the Earth. The dominant types of life are things like amphibians, but not amphibians like we have today. So you kind of have to imagine frogs filling the role of crocodiles, and things like that. So this ends in a gigantic extinction event that we don't know for sure what caused it. It wasn't an impact like it was at the end of the dinosaurs. But so now here, during this Permian, we have one supercontinent, right? So the supercontinent is called Pangaea. It has a northern and southern portion. The southern portion is called Gondwana. And here you have zones of subduction. Right? Now you also have the outlines of the continents. So here is Africa and South America. Here is North America and Europe. So a little bit more recognizable than it was before. And this is all going to start rifting apart and pulling apart as Pangaea splits. Here's Antarctica, Australia, India, and then the rest of Asia. So India and Asia were completely separated by something called the Tethys Ocean, or the Paleotethys. So that's the end of the Permian. If we then go into the Mesozoic, now here we are at the Triassic. We still have one supercontinent called Pangaea. We move into the Jurassic, and rifting is now occurring in Pangaea. So this used to be one plate. It's now being split into two tectonic plates. And it doesn't happen everywhere at once. North America and Europe separate first. And this little tiny ocean here, which we wouldn't even call an ocean, I think, if it was around today, is the Atlantic Ocean. This is the start of the Atlantic Ocean. And it's going to keep opening wider and wider as the continents drift further and further apart. And so now we have our southern continent, our southern portion of Pangaea, is stable over a relatively long period of time. And so that's why it has this name Gondwana land, or Gondwana, and it's sometimes called Gondwana land. And this northern part is called Laurasia. But you can see Laurasia is actually, it's not continuous, right? So North America is pretty well separated from Europe. Europe is actually a series of islands. And then the eastern parts of Asia are also a large landmass. And so we find lots of fossils here and lots of fossils there. And there's a tremendous amount of dinosaur fossils from Asia and also from North America and everywhere else too. But these are the places that there's always been a lot of interest in for the fossils that are produced there. So now that was the Jurassic. This is the Cretaceous, not the very end of it, kind of in the middle of it. And we have, it almost looks like today. So now the rifting of Pangaea has really accelerated. Gondwanaland has also been broken apart into South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Asia are still connected. There are small oceans between them. These are, again, places of subduction. North America is actually, it hasn't been rifted into two different continents. It's just that this area is very low and the Atlantic Ocean has filled it in. And this is a shallow seaway, sometimes called the Western Interior Seaway. So if you go to places like Kansas now, you will find, if you go to Kansas today, it's inland and it has nothing to do with the ocean. But the fossils there are all oceanic. There you find clams and fish and marine reptile fossils. So here's Africa with some other areas that are also inundated and underwater. Now we get into the Paleogene, and we have North America. The Western Interior Seaway has gone away. We have South America, the Indian Ocean, Africa, Asia, which still has its own interior seaway. And notice here, I'm going to step back. So India has broken off from Gondwanaland, and now it is getting very close to Asia. And so what was between them is the Tethys Ocean. But this border of the Tethys is a subduction zone. That means a plate is being pushed into this area and then being pulled under the ocean, under the Asian plate. So this ocean is growing smaller. This is a place of destruction where the seafloor is being destroyed. So we don't have this seafloor anymore. It's been lost. It's underneath. It's been buried in the mantle now. And we don't have very much of this material at all. And India is moving further and further as this stuff is being subducted. And now here in the Paleogene, 50 million years ago, they're very close together. You can kind of see this. I think this wrinkling is meant to show the start of the Himalayas. And now here is 21,000 years ago. So not, tremendously different from today. And we have North America and South America. We have you have the world that we're familiar with today. And so India has collided with Asia, producing the Himalayan mountains. There's been a lot of metamorphism there that is heating and changing the minerals that are present in these rocks. If you look going back, so right now actually, here's Antarctica, and you have something called the Southern Ocean today. It's able to go around the entire Antarctic continent. But in the past, that was fairly obstructed. So ocean currents that were here would run into this bridge and barrier of South America and Antarctica, and water could not flow from here into this place. So there was no Southern Ocean at that time. There was only an Atlantic and Pacific, and then the old Tethys. So the configuration of the continents actually really affects the movement of water, the distribution of heat across the world's surface, and it affects things like weather and climate. Okay. So here's 21,000 years ago. We're in an ice age, and that's kind of shown here by these iced out portions of the northern hemisphere. So even during these ice ages, you don't have ice sheets in the tropics or anything like that. If you go very back far in time to like the Cryogenian, then you can have tropical ice sheets. Okay, so that's kind of a quick or long, depending on your perspective, I guess, tour through geological time. But so again, we have our relative time, right? These terms that we use for rocks that are stacked on top of one another. So there are Calabrian rocks, and on top of them are Ionian rocks, and on top of them are Tarantian rocks. We also have absolute ages derived from radiometric dating, so we can assign now an actual age, a time for these relative dates. And then we have our magnetostratigraphy and our isotope stratigraphy. So it's about things like climate too. So everything we've talked about in this one chart. That covers a lot of different things, but I think it's relatively important that we kind of know not just where we are physically on the Earth, but where we are in terms of time.